Cool. Yeah. Well, welcome everybody to Cleveland React. I'm sorry. I said I was ready, and then I realized I just was not quite ready in my head. Tonight we're going to be going over React query with our friend Cameron and co-organizer of Cleveland React. Cam is a web developer at Findaway with nearly 20 years of experience in front-end development. And he has developed sites for brands like HH Gregg, Can Has Cheezburger, and Vonage. And for the past 7 years, he's been focusing on building audiobook technology for Findaway, which is a pretty cool company. Cleveland React, we have a code of conduct. Obviously, Cleveland React is a safe and friendly place for all people, and behavior that makes people feel unsafe is not welcome here. So please reach out to me in private, or Cam, and or on Twitter, or meetup, or hello at react, clereact.dev if you have any questions. As always, we're looking for speakers or event ideas, stuff like that. So if anybody has either topics they want to hear about, they want to learn about, or topics they would like to talk about or share with us, we'd love to hear from you. So either after the event or on Slack or on Meetup, please, feel free to reach out. We have, I think, I don't know, most people are probably on our Cleveland Slack. I'll put a link in the chat to the Cleveland Tech Slack. So we have a Cleveland React channel there that we kind of chill on sometimes. And yeah, I don't know. Is there anything else that we want to talk about before we get going? Does anybody else have anything they'd like to share, or announcements, or anything like that? Feel free to chime in now. You probably heard, but once we get started, if you have questions during the talk, I'm sure Cam will pause a couple times, but feel free to. I'll keep an eye on chat, so feel free to jump in on chat, and I'll get the questions over. And otherwise, I think I'm going to let you take it away.
Awesome. Thanks. Well, thanks everybody for coming out. Excuse me. Yeah, I'm going to talk about React Query. For those of you who don't know, I can't actually see Zoom right now, so I would ask you to virtually raise your hand if you've used it, but I can't actually see you. So that wouldn't really work. But for those of you that may not have known about React Query, or may know about it but don't really have a good sense of what it is, hopefully by the end of this talk, you'll have a little bit better sense of it and have a little bit better confidence in using it in your own applications. The most sort of succinct description I could give, or have found actually, for React is, or for React Query, is it is a set of hooks for fetching, caching, and updating data in React apps. So what does that really mean? Well, what does React Query provide? Like I said, it provides hooks. So use query, use mutation, use infinite query, those types of things. It provides those so that we can use them throughout our functional components to query, get, mutation, change data throughout our application. It provides a context initializer. So basically, it's just a function that we can use to initialize our client, and a context provider. So anybody who's sort of familiar with React context API, this should seem, it's not the same, but it's very similar. So it should feel very comfortable in how we set this up. And then ultimately, one of the major core features of React Query is it has a caching layer. So the data that you load in, the data that you manipulate will all be cached, and you have control over how long or how short of time that data is cached. And that allows you to really tune this to allow for optimized experiences, both on the front end, but also make sure you're optimizing your network requests to the back end. So what doesn't React Query provide? Well, the big thing is it doesn't really provide any request functionality. So if you need to make a request for something via Ajax or via REST API or via GraphQL, you have to bring your own. So it works with all the major or all the primary libraries and frameworks from standard XML HTTP request, Axios, which is what we'll be using today, as well as fetch, and then also GraphQL requests, which is a library for making GraphQL requests. We'll also use that today in our GraphQL example. Yeah, so let's just get into it. So let's say that we have a blog. It's called My Awesome Blog, and it has some articles. And yeah, it's pretty straightforward. So in our application, we have our post list. Can everybody see that? Or do you need me to bump the font size up?
Little small, yeah.
Here, how's that? Good.
Thanks.
All right, cool. So in our post list here, this is not using GraphQL. We're just looking at sort of how I've set this up prior to sort of adding React query to this. So here you can see we're loading in our data, or we have a local state for the data for our list of posts. We have some sort of state information about the status of our posts, and then we also have a list of authors that will load in. So so when our application loads, we have a use effect that just goes out, grabs all the authors, and sets them to the author's state. And then we have a use effect that does the same thing for the posts. And then it also ultimately updates all of the sort of status indicators for the application. And then we down here, we show that and we loop over our, excuse me, we loop over our posts and find the author and show all that. So that's kind of how we're doing that, without using React query. This is sort of how the typical way you would, handle this type of state data in a React application without using React query. And so for our, so for our single post page, the same thing. We're loading in our data. We have some, we're loading in our list of authors. We're loading in, or we're setting our sort of status state, and we're doing that in like much as we did before. We're doing that in use effects. So let's talk about what it takes to actually add React query to this. So like I said in the presentation, we actually have to create a query context. So that will be the first thing that we need to do. So in here, we're actually going to grab this line here. Well, first, we're going to import React query. So we're in an index. We're just going to import React query. We're going to import query client and query client provider. And then we're just going to update our render here to actually use the query client. So when you set up a query client, this line. We're going to create a client first. So first we create a query client, and that is basically, what controls everything. And actually, we're going to export that. We'll use it later straight from here. And then we set up our query client provider. Say that 10 times fast. And that's basically like anybody who's familiar with React Context API. This should look very familiar to a certain extent, very familiar in how you would set up a context provider. So once we have that set up, now we can go back over to our post list, and now we can use React query to start loading this data. So the first thing we're going to do is import. We're going to import React query. And we're just going to use query here because we don't need any mutations here. We don't need anything else. And then we're basically just going to replace all of this with these two lines. So we have the first one, which defines where you're saying use query. And we're saying so with this first argument is what's called the query ID or query key. I'm sorry, query key. And the cool thing that you can do, telling me there's a problem. The cool thing you can do is it doesn't just take a string. And a lot of the examples you'll see like on the React query website, they just have a string there like posts or to-dos or whatever. But if you dig deeper into the docs, the one cool thing you can do is instead of using like a string template or some other way of sort of creating this instead of just concatenating together a unique ID for that, we can actually use an array. And so we can say the first thing is this is posts, and then you can pass it an object, and it'll sort of create the cache, and it'll allow the cache to have these sort of very complex relationships to this data. And so anytime this page changes, that's going to be a new entry in the cache. And so this allows me to specify other things. If I had like a search, I could say search here, and then now we're going to have a cache entry tied to not only this page, but the page and the search query. Oh, sorry, there's like all sorts of VS Code stuff. And so it allows us in a very sort of modular way to create these very specific query keys that tie the data that gets loaded to the cache. And it really makes it powerful to be able to leverage that cache later on using by either extending the time that it gets cached, or there's some other properties that we could use to leverage that caching. But so you can see we took all of those status state variables, and now they're getting returned by use query. And we get our data back, and I'm renaming it here to posts, but I'm actually gonna not do that because that's different than what I had before. So and same thing with authors. So authors, we took the one line and which was originally basically just equivalent to this here, where we just load the authors and we put them into an authors variable. And before, if we want to know whether the authors were loading, or if the authors had an error, we'd have to create another state, use state, and we'd have a state variable and a set state function and things like that. And now with React query, we just get that. And so we can use it or we don't need to use it, but it's available to us, and we don't have to worry about creating any additional state variables to house that information. So now let's go ahead and see if that works. Data isn't defined. No, it's not. So there we go. Now we have nothing changed, and we're loading our data with React query, and we can see it's still paginated just as it was before. But you can see those subsequent page loads load much quicker than they did. Oh, see that flash? I don't know, it might be too fast for you guys, but there's a flash. But as you page back through it, those pages are instantly loading because those are cached by React query. So immediately we're seeing benefit to how we're loading this data via React query. Whoa, I have no idea what I just did. Okay, that's weird. My computer's being strange. So let's do, okay. So you can see that when we load, are you kidding me? Bear with me. Okay, so you can see that we are loading. Let's go back to. So you can see we're loading the first page of posts, and we're loading the users. And then when we click next, oh wait, we loaded the posts to the second page, but we also loaded the users again. Well, that's not good. So let's see if we can't. And also, I want to fix that issue that we were having before, where authors was undefined when the page initially loaded. So one of the things that we can do to fix that is we can actually use so you can pass a bunch of options to your use query. So you can pass object options to your use query. And so one of the ones you can pass is called enabled, and you can give it a Boolean, and if the Boolean is false, then it won't actually run that query until that Boolean is true. So the one thing that we can do to fix this issue here, we actually don't need this optional chaining, is to basically defer loading any posts until the authors have loaded. So now if I go here, if I reload this page, no, actually re-enable this data cache here. So you can see this page loads, and we're not getting that error anymore because we've deferred that. We're also not loading users every time because we already have it. So yeah, that's that's adding in going from sort of the way that we do loading Ajax and dynamic data now using state variables to going and loading a list of posts with React Query. And so we can do the same thing for our single post. Again, we're gonna have to import React Query. And we're going to load our posts. And so we can get rid of all of these. And we can get rid of this. And then we're going to load our authors. I'm sorry, author. And so now you can see we're using use query to load in our post by post ID. And then we're actually doing sort of the reverse that we did before, loading in the author, but we're deferring that to make sure that we load our post data first. Otherwise, it's just going to fail because data is undefined and it doesn't know what the author ID is. So we're flipping that scenario that we did before, where we're actually loading the post first, then the author. But you can see that it still works or it doesn't. I guess I do need option. Oh. I need optional chaining in more than one place, that's why. There we go. So loading in this, we still get our single post. So any questions so far on what, just sort of going from how things sort of typically get loaded and swapping in a React query? Nope.
Doesn't look like it.
Okay. Either you're all asleep or I'm doing a pretty decent job of explaining things. Cool. So one of the things that would be really helpful is if we have a blog is we might want to edit one of these posts. Like maybe we made a mistake and we want to add an edit button. So let's go ahead and add an edit button, and we're actually let's add an edit route. And we'll take a look at mutations. So now we have this route to edit a post. What does that mean though? So let's take a look at that. So here we see we have a very simple form, just two fields, an input, a text area, and a button. And then we again load in a post data initially using use query. And then I'm using Formic to sort of wrangle all the form stuff. If you're not familiar, maybe that's a good future topic for the group because Formic is awesome. And I won't go into the finer details of sort of how this is set up, but ultimately, when we submit, we make a call to a mutation.mutate. Well, what is a mutation? Well, like I said before, React Query provides a use mutation hook. So you can define this use mutation hook and you provide it. The first argument is your mutation function. So basically it needs to return, well, can kind of return whatever you want, but typically you would have it return any return data from your asynchronous request to mutate your data. So in this case, I'm saying put to the posts/post ID with our new data object, and that gets passed in when you call mutate. And then on success, so you can, again, like the use query hook, you can pass in an object of options, and then one of the options is on success. So when that mutation successfully happens, what should we do? And so we're going to get passed in a set of data, which is basically just, again, the data that's returned from this mutation function. And then here I'm calling query client, which remember we set that up back in index.js, our query client here that we exported. That's the whole thing, the whole shebang of the query data and cache. So I'm saying, hey, query client, update this record with this query key, post ID, with the data that I just got back from the server. And then I'm pushing the back to the sort of standalone single post page. And then I just call that, like I showed before, I just gather up my, I gather up my sort of new post data here. I console log out, but then call a asynchronous mutation.mutate, passing it the new data. It calls this function here, makes the post request, so on and so forth. So let's take a look at that, what that looks like in the browser. If I change the title here, save. Oh, well, that didn't save. Well, it didn't save for two reasons. The major reason is that the API that I'm using does not actually save data. So that's the first one. The second one is, though, well, we knew that changed and we updated the cache, remember? Well, why didn't the cache update? Well, React Query, unlike some frameworks like Redux, or I'm assuming MobX, I'm not familiar with it, but I'm assuming it's similar. Those are client state management frameworks. React Query is a server state management framework. So while it does cache your data on the client side, its primary concern is data on the server side. And so it's always going to default to say the data that it has in its cache is wrong, is invalid or out of date. And so it's always going to, when it can, or when it thinks it needs to, based on sort of the cache timeout, as well as when queries are mounted and unmounted, it will always go back and request new data from the server, unless, like, you know, for some reason this page refreshed, like if I did a hot module refresh here, you probably wouldn't see it refresh because it already has it in state. So one way we can get around that is if we know our data isn't changing significantly, or we always have sort of, maybe we're the only people that ever edit it. So we know that if we just changed it and saved it, that change is the latest. We can actually just like make our cache time longer. And then that way the data that we have, we know isn't changing. And so we can keep it around in the client longer without having to go back to the server for it every time the page loads, or every time, or not the pages, but every time you change routes in the application, or every time you do something that would make React Query think that it needs to go back to the server. So the way you do that is you can actually provide an object of config here for the query client, and then you can say, oh shoot, I always forget this. I'm gonna jump over to the docs real quick because I forgot what it was. So you can set the stale time. So you can actually define, so cache time, everything is cached for 5 minutes, but the stale time is always 0. So it assumes that everything is always stale. And so you can actually just extend, you can set the stale time. I just gotta remember how to do that. It's like a nested item on an object. And so I always forget what the nesting structure is.
If the stale time is always 0, how does it leverage the cache?
It leverages the cache. Actually, this is the article here. So they do it's very wordy, but they do a pretty decent example of explaining here how the caching works. It says, let's assume we're using the default cache time of 0 and the default stale time of 0, or I'm sorry, cache time of 5 minutes and the default stale time of 0. Basically, they break down a few scenarios. So a new instance of use query mounts. There are no other queries that have been made with this query variable combination. And so they make a request to the server. The hook will mark itself as stale after the configured stale time, which is 0. Then a second instance of to-dos mounts elsewhere because the exact data exists in cache from the first instance of this query. That data is immediately returned from the cache. So, and then they also do things like background refreshing. And then both instances of use query to-dos query are unmounted and no longer in use. So, the reason that it refetched when I went from the edit page to the single post page is because the query that I had ran in the single post page when I went to it the first time, unmounted when I left that page and went to the edit page, and then the query that I made in the edit page unmounted when I went to that page. And so there were no more instances of that query occurring or living on in the application. And so therefore it assumed that cache was, it was basically garbage collected at that point. And so it wasn't keeping around the cache for that because it didn't exist. And you can sort of get around that by, and again, the whole point is not, this does not replace things like Redux where you want to keep around that data at all times until you determine that it needs to go away or change. This is purely to improve performance around times when you're within that 5 minutes going within the same component or within a component where that query is still mounted, you're going from, you're traversing through. So in the example of the paginating through the list of posts, you could see that as the first time I would hit each page, you would see it blip the loading. And then as I would go back through them, it was instantaneous because the query didn't unmount and we have it in cache and it had not been 5 minutes yet. Does that make sense or sort of answer the question?
Yeah, it does. I'm trying to think through like other use cases because it kind of seems like the caching would really be limited to that scenario where you have pagination or you have two components using the same query hook at the same time on the page together. Because as soon as if you're doing it between pages, it's always going to be an unmount and remount scenario, which would invalidate cache. So, are there other scenarios where that cache would be really valuable to have around?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, yeah, you could look at it in the case of user information, profile information. You know, you may be using profile information across multiple components on a single page. You know, you have an example like an e-commerce store. You have a shopping cart button at the top, or you have other elements on the page that leverage the user or profile information. Well, instead of necessarily needing to put that into Redux or into some sort of global state storage, you can leverage React query and say, okay, I'm going to use the same query in all of these components, and they're all going to occur within a similar time frame. And so the first one's going to get executed, and then all the subsequent ones are going to use cache. And then maybe you load in a new element on the page and it uses the same query. Those are the scenarios where that excels very well. I think there are definitely, and I mean, and again, like to reiterate, this is not meant to replace things like Redux, where if you want to fetch data and keep it and make sure that you never fetch that data again until you programmatically decide that it needs to be refreshed, like that's what those libraries are for. But the documentation here for this really specifically says that it is, you know, they're two different things. React query is server state library, and Redux and those types of things are client state, which I think is sort of where you're getting at with, you know, having all this data in one place and being able to leverage it without making network requests very quickly. And that's what tools like Redux and MobX actually excel at. But this is mainly a tool set to replace like cumbersome boilerplate, like I showed initially, where setting up state for status of requests and storing that data in a state to the component and things like that. Caching is merely a nice to have thing that it's built in and can be tweaked and utilized to improve performance, but it doesn't necessarily remove or replace the necessity to go fetch the data from the server again at some point.
Yeah, and if I could jump in real quick, this was something that took me a minute to understand when the first time I was, really digging into this, but the difference between cached and stale. So if you make a request like a blog, like the specific blog post, right, it will be cached, and then you can go to some other entirely different routes or anything. And, if you go back to that blog post or another query using the same query key, it will be cached but stale, right? And so what that means is it'll display the data. It'll give you the old data first. That's the powerful thing of the cache with React Query is it'll give you the old one first and then refetch in the background. So you won't get the is loading initially. Like it will. Right. It'll give you the cache data first if it's stale, right? It'll give you the cache data always, and then if it's stale, it'll refetch it in the background. And so that's like,
yep.
That took me a long time to wrap my head around.
Does it expose some sort of Boolean or something to say that it's loading in the background?
I think
it does actually. Yeah. So background refreshes actually have their own. It's not something that I was planning on necessarily covering in this, but it's a great topic to talk about. So you can, so they have a good document here on like if you want to display global background fetching state, or there's a global one where they actually expose a use is fetching a hook. But for your use query here, so you actually have two properties that get exposed by use query. You get status, or you get which is loading, loaded, loading, success, error. It's basically like the enumerable equivalent to the is loading, is success, is error examples that I had in the application here for the use query. And then you also have is fetching. So the status might be loading, and the status might be error, and at least in their example here, they're basically saying if it's not loading, if it's not error, then it's, I guess, success. And then you can also use is fetching. So you kind of have this state where you're like, okay, well, I have, it's not initially loading, or loading, I guess, and it's not errored. So it's showing something because I have some sort of data, and then I can say like, oh, it's fetching. So in the background, it's actually going out and getting more data. So there you can say is fetching, and maybe you're still showing, to Dan's point, you may be showing that initial stale list of to-dos, but you're also able to say like, oh, it is fetching. So you can show a spinner or whatever to give the indication that the data is being refreshed in the background.
Nice.
And that's where, like, when I said initially, I tried to find some good examples to show. This is, I almost feel like this is a super deep rabbit hole of things that they have built into React Query that are that make it just really powerful to use. So, well, I can't find the damn parameter for how I set stale time, because it's like nested, and so I think I can just do. Let's see if I can just do this. So instead of setting it here, I can just set it here. Stale time, and let's say see if that does. So we have our data there. Whoops. So we click edit, test, save, and now you can see that that's reflected because it hasn't, the stale time hasn't occurred. So it's still using the test data. You know, maybe you want to set in this. So again, they set a sort of relatively aggressive default stale time of 0. You may want to, like, if you know, again, if you know your data, it doesn't update, but, you know, once every, infrequently, you know, once a day or once every couple hours or whatever, you know, like, oh, like if I fetch it now, it's not going to necessarily potentially change within the next 10 minutes. Okay, great. Then set the stale time to 10 minutes because you know it's not going to change, and you can just continue using the cache that you have because you can faithfully know that it's not going to change. So that's kind of one of the powerful things you have with React Query, is being able to, well, again, the defaults are relatively aggressive. You do have the ability to sort of tweak that to the necessity of your application. So cool. Any other questions on mutations? Going back to mutations.
Yeah, we had a question in the chat.
Cool.
Just more about Joe was wondering if there is a case for using React Query like alongside something like Redux or, you know, another state management.
That's a great question. You know, I think if you read React Query's documentation, they probably lean towards no. I think that if you read their documentation, they're a little bit opinionated about how they feel about Redux. You know, we use it alongside Redux in a few of our applications at Findaway. We don't necessarily update Redux with React Query, but we'd certainly use it alongside some legacy Redux stuff where we're storing sort of, again, like to my example before, we're storing like global application level information. So, you know, like you log in, you get your profile, we throw the profile information into Redux. And then, you know, in a couple other places throughout the application, we're using React Query to sort of do the component level handling of, fetching data and doing all that. So I think that, to me, and this is just my personal opinion, I don't know that there's really like an official opinion at any level, but that's sort of how I see these two things living side by side. And I would even personally, we're moving away from Redux and moving to React Context API, and that's more or less just a personal choice. But I think any of those sort of global application state libraries could certainly be used alongside this. I think it forces you to sort of draw a line in the sand to say, well, does this need to be used by the entire application, put it in Redux, or does it just need to be used by this component and maybe a few child components? Then maybe React Query is a better option for that. Or you could establish a pattern around, in this case, or I guess in certain cases where you may load in one component with React Query and then leverage the cache for other subsequent requests or subsequent child components without having to prop chain or prop drill things down or do some weird roundabout ways of getting that data from one component to another, or creating another React Context API type situation where you're now, there's a lot of overhead to that sort of thing where maybe the occasional extra network request or background refresh isn't necessarily a bad thing. And so it doesn't hurt to have something like React Query that, in most cases will, leverage the cache, and then occasionally it's going to background refresh, and then everything's going to get updated, and you're not going to have to worry about, how those things cascade and things like that. Hopefully that was a good rundown of how I sort of see those two things interact. Cool. So that's mutations. You also have on success, and you have on error. You have a couple others, and you have a lot of options that you can provide to mutations. But this was sort of a minimal example here to sort of get up and running. Cool. So we've looked at how to load in, sort of a list of data. We've looked at sort of how to load in a single title along with authors. And we've looked at mutations. At some point you're going to upgrade your CMS and maybe switch to something like Contentful or some modern CMS that delivers in GraphQL. So how do we do that? Well, we don't have to throw away React Query. And that's actually one of the really great things about React Query is we can actually just switch to GraphQL, and we don't have to throw away really a whole lot of what we've done. So if you take a look at here, I'm going to actually create a new variable there. And then so for our list of data, I already have a GraphQL request installed. So we're just gonna replace Axios with request and GQL from GraphQL. I'm sorry, GraphQL request. And then we're gonna so it's a little bit bigger just because of how the sort of the footprint of GraphQL, but then we can actually just replace. We can actually, because of how this API, this GraphQL API is set up, but sort of if anybody's familiar with GraphQL and sort of how one of its benefits is, we don't have to get the author and the narrator anymore. Or I'm sorry, the author and the post anymore. It all comes back as part of the it comes back as part of the request. So I'm gonna go ahead. that. We can comment these out, or we can get rid of these. We don't need those anymore. And you can see now, it's very similar to what we were doing before. We're still loading in, returning or getting back data. We're getting back is loading. We're getting back is success. And we're getting back is error. And we're still using use query. We're still defining our query key as posts, and then this object defining the page number. But this time we're gonna just define a anonymous async function here. And we're gonna make a request to GraphQL endpoint. This is our GraphQL schema, or our query here. So we're querying posts, paginating based on limit and page. We're getting back ID and title and body and user. And then we're passing in limit 10 and then the page number here. And then that returns back this function here returns back the data. Come up here. And so we actually don't need this line anymore because we already have the author. And actually author changes to user. It's still user, sorry. And now it didn't actually test the GraphQL stuff. So this is where it's going to be fun. Bear with me. I could have sworn I installed this. Restart the server. And all right, my apologies. Let's take a look at this. Oh, I actually have to install GraphQL. NPM was supposed to solve all this for us. Thought it was supposed to know about all the dependencies. So it looks like we might be up back. Nope. My server crashed.
We had a, while you're working on that, we had a question about about React Query's performance and whether you've run any profiling on it or anything like that.
I haven't had a chance to run any sort of performance profiling on it. I would be very interested to know or to see some profiles on how it helps to improve, load times, especially when paginating data, and also just subsequent requests. So yeah, unfortunately, I haven't.
Personally, I mean, I kind of feel the same, but I feel like it is actually, I'm not sure about profiling the library itself, but the output of it, you get really sort of very large returns because of the way it handles another thing. And this goes back to the stale and cached, data stuff that we were talking about before. But if you don't interrupt, if you don't like try to wrangle it, right, and just let it do its thing, if a response has cached data, it will go and fetch a new version in the background if it's stale, but it won't mess up all of your references. Like it won't overwrite the data if it's the same. Like React, this is like one of the nice things that React Query does behind the scenes, that you don't really have to think about, but it won't change. It won't change the data if the data didn't change. I don't know if that makes sense. Like it probably only makes sense if you've run into like use effects or use memo, nightmares, with data references changing, stuff like that. And so it's like downstream performance benefits are large. I can't really speak to profiling data on the library itself, but
Yeah,
I just
for
wanted
sure.
to throw that in there because it's just a little piece of it.
Yeah, and I think ultimately, like, the benefit of React query comes, like, as the caching is sort of the cherry on top, but the whole sundae is how much less boilerplate there is to set this stuff up and utilize the same queries across multiple components in your application. To be able to go from 4 or 5 state variables down to or 4 or 5 lines of state variables down to sort of one line, and you can sort of pick and choose the things you need out of that. And it's repeatable across application or across components. To me, that's the benefit of it, less so than actual performance. So yeah, so you can see now, now that I've gotten past the bumps in the road, we now have this page here loading in with GraphQL. And again, it's paginating very quickly until I hit a new page, and then it goes slow. This must be a much slower server than the other one. But you can see as I paginate back through it, you don't get that loading every time. It is, to Dan's point that he made, it is making the requests in the background for each new page, but it doesn't actually need to update the page because the cache didn't change.
Yeah, so if in the background one of these dates changed to January 2 or something, it would load, and then you'd actually see it swap in,
right?
Without a big mess.
Yeah, or if
and without having to think about it at all either.
Right, or if through the time that you're looking at this, you're looking at all these articles. There's 10 of them here, and by the time you get down to the bottom to paginate, another article has been added. So really, these articles all shift in time, and this is sort of a symptom of how we're paginating this. I know there are better ways to paginate things with pointers and whatnot that sort of tend to look to solve some of this, but that data would change. You go to the next page and it would change that maybe you'd already gone to that page, but it had articles had shifted. So you get that benefit. You don't get that like shocking flash of missing content initially. You get something and then it'll update itself. So yeah, that's GraphQL. Move this tools thing out of the way. I'll go ahead and update the single post page, but it's pretty much the same. Oops. So we're going to go get rid of our 2 requests and just go down to 1. Say thank you, GraphQL.
We have a request for you to click the performance tab in the browser next time you're.
Yeah, for sure.
Next time you're over there. I was trying to use the React profiler on Firefox today, and it was just totally broken. It was like some bug or something. I don't know. It's weird. There's like 4,000 issues with the exact same error message, and they were like auto responding to all of them. Like, can you please add more information? And it was just like, so it's not related to React query at all. It's just very frustrating.
It really does not like my individual query here, and I don't know why. But yeah, we can take a look at the this page here and take a look at the profile thing. Performance of this. Performance or
Well, the request I was talking about the profiler. The request was for the performance tab. I'm not sure, Gaurav, if you want to add any more details to that request. But the request was, can you click on the performance tab?
I did, yes.
So
I
suppose
can
we have
run a
to-
performance. I can hear. We can.
Yeah, there you go.
So
Maybe
yeah,
just do some pagination or something. I don't know.
I went through forward 2 pages and then back 2 pages. Let's take a look. That's a lot of stuff.
Yeah, hey Cam. I was just curious because in their issues list on the project's GitHub, there was a few revisions back. They said, oh, we had a lot of when we used like about a month ago, somebody claimed that it's causing like a little bit of a slowdown. Just having like React query in the project. So I got curious. I was like, oh, okay. So if I had 3.13.0, version, I should be able to experience the performance degradation. But in any case, the team actually closed that issue, so it's closed right now. That specific issue. So it just caught my eye. I was just curious to see the performance of the profiler at least in the dev tools, just to kind of get a understanding of like in a application like this that you've authored, what does it actually look like? What's the spend? What's going on? So here there's probably you can kind of see like there's some rich information here as time progresses in milliseconds. What's the utilization on your the heap, how much is Node.js using, what's the GPU utilization there. So at the bottom there's a summary which tells you the kind of the spread, the division, basically. In a complex application, lots of components, you'll probably have more fun capturing that state. And as a result, tethering that with your network tab, you can basically have a little bit more concrete view of, the client side, what it's doing. Of course, this is just, a blog. I understand that. There's only, but still, I mean, that's okay. Like the numbers that I'm seeing, that's cool.
Yeah,
yeah.
It's something I definitely I think I'll probably play around with more. And this is a pretty simple application, but I know for some of our more complex applications,
your production code, you can really have fun with this. And it helps to, like, as you're kind of going through your development process, kind of keep an eye on it. I mean, not to say that beat the team over it, like, hey, like this guy did, but whatever.
No. Yeah. It's a great thing to keep in mind. We use this in right now it's in one of our big production applications. And it's, we haven't seen any negative impacts to using it.
Right.
And so it's not used across the entire application. Like I said, it's one of those applications where we're still doing stuff about 3 different ways. We're using React Query for some stuff. We're using sort of local state loading of data for certain things. And then we do still have Redux in that application handling some additional state management, and then also, in conjunction with loading data via the API. But overall, we have not seen any negative impacts to, implementing React Query into the application. So, but performance is always something to keep in mind, and especially when you're integrating, third-party libraries and things like that you don't have sort of eminent control over. It's always good to make sure they're not introducing, memory issues or, that sort of junk into your application that you can't really control. So, Cool. So yeah, that was, sort of doing GraphQL. I'm not sure why this loading in a single post isn't working for some reason. I'd have to dig in and, I bet it's something like that, or not. It's not actually giving me an error.
We had a question about oh, this is query the actual API libraries, but comparing request query with Apollo for GraphQL.
Yeah, I've used Apollo a little bit. This is my first time using GraphQL request. I kind of like this a little bit more. The one thing with Apollo is it has its own caching layer as well. So Apollo actually does a lot of caching and whatnot. I think you kind of have to choose, do you want to go the route of all Apollo and you get some of the benefits that are built into that? Now that's a big library, that's a big framework for GraphQL. It's, it's the creme de la creme sort of frameworks. Or do you want to sort of do, sort of roll your own and leverage React query? As far as like using Apollo versus GraphQL request, they kind of feel the same to me. They don't really feel different. I think the thing I love about using GraphQL request and React query is that right now we do all REST stuff at Findaway. For like 90% of our applications are all REST APIs. We have one application right now that uses GraphQL, and it uses Apollo because at the time I didn't know about React query and I did not know about GraphQL request. Now that I know about React query and we're using React query for our REST applications, I'm probably at some point going to go back to that application and say, okay, we need to update this to use React query and GraphQL request and leverage the patterns that we've established for other applications, and make, now we don't have this application that looks completely different than everything else because it uses Apollo. So I don't know if that really, it kind of beats around the question because it's more or less a choice thing. I don't think they're that much different than each other between the two libraries, but I think it comes down to, how do you want to leverage, do you want to leverage React query, and what are you leveraging across all your other things that you're building as well. So cool. So that's sort of the end of the demo. I'm gonna jump back to this here. So yeah, that was sort of the demo. I kind of wanted to just touch on a couple things, some important concepts that I've sort of come across as I've been working with React query. So auto refetching and polling, you can actually set a refetch interval to control like how often things would get refetched. You can also the GraphQL query, React query comes with sort of out of the box set by default to true, which is refetch on window focus. So when you jump back and forth and your browser window goes into the background and then it gets refocused, it'll actually make another request to the API. Again, we talked about stale time, so we talked about that cache lifetime. You can right now it's by default it's set to 0. You can make that as long as you want to sort of keep that cache around. And then automatic retries. So anytime there's an error, it'll actually retry. I think it's effectively like it waits like 10 seconds and makes a request. Then every time it makes a request, that time doubles up to 30 seconds or something like that. So it's like, it'll keep trying for a few times and then it'll eventually, fail and say, hey, I can't load that data. So it tries to be a little bit proactive in your in trying to recover from errors. So for some reason there was some sort of temporary blip in the connection between your machine and the server. It'll try to recover from that, and then if it can't, it'll give back that is error or set that state to error, that status to error. So those are sort of the four big important concepts or things that I have found as I've been working with React Query that like the first two kind of bite me every once in a while. I always forget about the refetch on window focus. And I'm like, why does it keep making requests? Why there's so many requests? Like, oh yeah, because I keep jumping back and forth between Visual Studio Code and my browser. And then obviously the stale time and the retries and stuff. So that's it. That's my talk. I hope you all enjoyed it. And yeah, does anybody have any questions? Yeah, does anybody have any questions?
So I know you mentioned that you haven't noticed any like negative effects with implementing React Query into your projects. Have you heard though, like what do people knock React Query on? Like the development community is obviously very opinionated, and I'm always looking for like the dude in the room that says, oh, that's terrible, and here's the reasons why. Like what are the counter arguments for using this library?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know any specifically off the top of my head. I also try to stay away from the negative comments because this is in this industry, everybody has a negative comment. And so, I kind of, teach his own and decide what works best for you. But, the thing negatives for me, and I wouldn't even call them negatives. They're just sort of like things you have to be aware of and accept or figure out how to bend to your will. And like I said, React Query has so many configuration options that you should be able to sort of make it bend to your will, which is, it is very opinionated about how often it requests new data. You kind of go into it and it's like caching and you go, okay, great, caching, that's awesome. I that's responsible. And then you start doing it and you're like, but wait, you keep making requests to React Query. Like, what are you doing? And that's kind of like, to me, that's that's not a negative, but it's just sort of like it's like a WTF moment with React Query. Like, I thought this was supposed to like make this so much better. But really you're just like doing it behind the scenes. And then you start to click in your head and say like, oh, to Dan's point, like, oh, it's doing it sort of as a precautionary measure, or as not a precautionary measure, but like as a, like a fail safe, like it's using the cache, and that's what it's there to help improve the user experience around flashes of content and things like that. And if it doesn't need to update, it doesn't need to update, but it still makes that sort of precautionary request to see if it needs to update. But that'll be one of those things. It's like, if you were to do these requests the way that I showed the first time, sort of just plain Jane, Ajax and component state way, like it's gonna make the request every time your component loads. So you jump, you're paging through things and it's gonna load again. But it's gonna load and you're gonna get a loading thing, which might be a spinner or the word loading or some fancy graphic every single time, versus with React Query, you're getting content right away, and then maybe that content changes, maybe it doesn't, but at least you're getting something and you're not seeing this like weird jumping of the page or flashing of content. And so I think the negative for me is just that wasn't clear on the surface, that that's sort of the intent and what they mean by caching and how that caching is beneficial to what you're doing versus sort of what everybody thinks about in caching terms, which is like, oh, we're caching that. We don't have to make a request for it again, and it's going to be there, and we'll decide when we get to make a request for it. Well, that's a little bit different of a pattern than we're used to. So that's kind of the one thing that I see as like a gotcha. But again, I haven't really like dug up any dirt on React Query. Maybe somebody else has, maybe other people know of other things, like it's, secretly just like a, Ethereum, mining ring, and, we're all just getting taken, for losers or whatever. But hey, if it makes it easier to write requests and it makes my application, run smoother, then what, take my Ethereum. I don't give a crap. But yeah, so I don't know. I'm sorry, I don't have a great answer to that, but I just, it's really outside my it's outside my peripheral vision to like worry about what other people think about libraries.
Yeah, I was gonna say I literally have never heard anybody say anything bad at say they don't like React Query. Yeah, and usually you do. You're right. Like usually
Mhm.
there's somebody, complaining about something with any library, with any framework or anything like this. And React Query is like Cameron was saying, it's just like the wrapping your head around how it works it's different, because we're so used to step by step saying, okay, go fetch the thing. Okay, here, send it to Redux. Okay, go refetch the thing, and React Query does a lot of this for you and in a really, really, in my opinion, at least smart way. But it's a sort of a paradigm shift, a mental paradigm shift, to that's, I mean, I totally agree with what Cam said too. It's like, that's the biggest, I don't even call it a downside, but that's like, it's a
learning curve.
consideration.
Yeah, it's a learning curve. I was just gonna say that. Yeah.
Exactly.
How long did it take you guys to feel like you were comfortable? You were on the other end of that learning curve.
I still don't feel like I'm fully comfortable with it. It's one of those things that like even having used it multiple times on multiple applications at varying degrees of complexity for things, looking at the documentation and trying to like really wrap my head around it, I still constantly am just jumping back to the documentation or jumping back to other applications and go like, how the hell did I do that? Like, what was the pattern for how to like write use query? Because I forgot. And then even just as I was putting together this talk, I learned about the pattern for query keys where you can use an array and an object and keys and values to create these very specific query keys. I always thought I just had to use a string template, and that's how you had to do it. And so, while I feel probably took me, a couple of projects. I don't even want to give an amount of time, but it took me a few times using it through, projects at work and then, personal projects. And then obviously putting together this talk to just really like continue to feel a little bit like it's a little bit easier to reach for every time than the way that I would do it before, where it's just like, it's almost muscle memory for me to, write up a, use effect and some, use state and, throw things in there and go that route. Where with this, I have to like tell myself to like stop for a second and be like, oh no, like React query, okay, use query, like, go that route. And remember like, okay, what are all the things that get sent back from React here from use query? Like, is loading in progress? Like, is it, what are those things? And so I'm constantly always just like jumping back and forth to old projects to be like, oh yeah, that's how we do it. That's how we do it. So, it's just constantly for me, always getting better at it and getting easier to reach for it.
Yeah. And I just like to, I mean, I feel the same way. It was, I couldn't tell you a specific amount of time, but their docs are really good. Their docs are really good. They have a lot of on the docs, like article style articles, as well as what you would like API, API reference docs. But the articles are like, I mean, I call them articles. They call them guides and concepts, right? And it takes you a few times. I've read a number of these like a number of times because the first time you read them, it doesn't make any sense, and then like once you start digging in, different pieces make more sense. And so I come back to their docs. I have their docs set up all the time. And it's not because I mean, it's both because I can't remember the syntax, or specifically, but that I just go back and I kind of reread what they advise to do in certain situations or how they handle things. And most of the time they have answers or at least suggestions for any given scenario that I've run into so far.
I would agree with Dan. The documentation has been almost indispensable when trying to like just navigate your way through understanding how to implement it. If I could write some sort of like yarn post install hook to like just, if I installed React Query, open up the docs for me, that way I don't have to remember to go do that. Because these guides and concepts are very helpful, very helpful. Their examples are really good too. And they have one that does Rick and Morty. So sign me up. It's awesome. But yeah, it's parallel queries is something that is really interesting. Like they just have all these great examples of like different scenarios that you would run into that like auto refetching and polling. Oh, I was going to try to show infinite loading, but I don't think the APIs that I use are necessarily hooked up right for it. But yeah, they have just some really great examples, and their guys are really good.
Yeah, and that's another nice thing about it being just hook based. Like ultimately, you're just making React hooks, and I mean using them, and so there's like fancy approaches for parallel queries, but like literally, if you just do two separate use queries in the same component for two different requests, they'll run parallel by default, like out of the box by default with like literally no effort. It's cool. It's like I don't know, once you kind of dig into it a little bit, like the kind of stuff you can do. And Cameron was talking earlier about the enabled I don't know what you call it, parameter. And like that's how you can do dependent, so if you like this where you want to get the list and then also a specific blog post or whatever the author from, it ends up being pretty easy once you like I never want to say understand. I never want to say it is easy, but like once you have like clicked your brain around it, like once you've, gone through the paradigm shift, then it becomes easy.
Yeah, just don't forget your optional chaining or whatever.
Right. Right.
Cool.
Yes.
Any other questions?
Is this compatible with WebSockets, or is that not really within the use cases of this?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know. I guess maybe it would be. I don't do too much with WebSockets, so I unfortunately don't have a good context to say. But I guess if you're anything you can do with fetch or XML HTTP request or any sort of what we generally call AJAX, if WebSockets falls into that category, then I don't see why I wouldn't. Yeah, I know that there's some different patterns around WebSockets, so I'm not 100% sure.
Okay. And do you have a sense of like how heavy of a library this is in terms of dependencies?
Oh, it's a good question. Most good libraries put that right on their homepage. I don't know if React Query does, but that's a great question. See if
they
can go to GitHub.
they're saying 11.5 kilobytes,
Okay.
which is I'm just looking at their site. It's not like I have information off the top of my head, but they have a comparison on their like comparison. They have like a page that literally has comparisons with other libraries, and so they're at 11.5. SWR is a very, very low level one, and that's like 5, but Apollo is like 34. So for instance,
yeah, that's a good point. I forgot about the shoot, where's that? That's the comparison section.
Yeah, it's up there.
Yeah, I forgot about that. Yeah, so they have a really good comparison here, comparing it against a few other libraries. I know there was a question about Apollo client, and then this SWR and RTK query, which I literally have never heard of before. Sorry if those are anybody's frameworks here. Yeah, 11.5K, 5.1K apparently for this one. It's the one we should be talking about. 34 and 10. So it's not huge. It's not small. I don't know the exact sort of dependency tree of it. But I gotta guess that like most of its dependencies are probably dependencies in other things that you probably already have if you're using React. So, you're probably not adding too much additional weight, but it's a good thing to look into.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah, man, I haven't messed with WebSockets either, but React Query, like anything that is async, it doesn't even have to be fetching at all. It'll take any async or promise, I've considered trying to wrap it around doing something that's not at all fetch related, just as an experiment. I've never actually done it, but
yeah, it'd be interesting. I mean, in theory, you could, you know, yeah, to Dan's point, you know, if we look at these Zoom tools out of the way, you know, if we look at, just look at my example here. I guess. Effectively, you know, we're wrapping this around any asynchronous function. So really, this doesn't have to be this. This could just be this could be.
I mean, you could just return an object there, and you
Yeah.
don't even.
Yeah,
since
yeah.
since it's already async, you don't even have to
Yeah.
do anything fancy.
Yeah.
You could return an object if you wanted. I'm not
Yeah.
sure exactly why you would want to, but
Right. Yeah, you could do that. You could just return anything here. You could return a promise itself, or you could return, you know, you could do a set timeout and then just have your set timeout return an object. It really just cares that this function returns something. It doesn't very much care how it returns that something. So, you know, I think the assumption is that it's asynchronous because that's how requests are made. But yeah, ultimately, like this could just be return data.
Yeah, my last project used WebSockets pretty heavily, and you could probably set that up for the send and response side of the equation. But that's only like half of the equation for WebSockets. Like the real power there is the subscriptions to what's being broadcasted. And I don't know that that would really hook in too well with this because it's not a trigger and wait scenario. It's more just listen and wait. But
Yeah.
so I think it could definitely plug in if you're doing a lot of sending to the WebSocket, but if you're doing a lot of just listening on the WebSocket, it might not be the right tool.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering mainly.
Cool. Any other questions? Any other thoughts on React Query?
oh, I think we're in good shape. Unless anybody
Thanks,
else. Sorry, what was that? I don't know if I missed something.
No, it's just thanks for putting this together.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you very much, Cameron. It was a very good talk, and I mean I keep jumping. I love React Query, so I was really pumped to that. And yeah, I mean I definitely even picked up some new tips and everything. What was I gonna say? Yeah. So I guess that's it for today's meetup. I'm sorry, I'm like super out of practice on this, so I don't have my script in front of me anymore. We are working, yes, next talk. That's what I was just gonna say. We're working on pulling together. We don't have anything scheduled right now. This is where you know, if anybody would like to think about giving a talk or what even just topic suggestions, we're always, you know, we always want to hear them. And we'll pull something together for next month. Yeah, probably at least within a month. Also, you may or may not have noticed, but the next JS conversion has not launched yet. I fell into the classic trap of trying to redo the design while also redoing the next, Gatsby to next conversion. So, but that is up on in a pull request. So if anybody is like really wants to dig in with Tailwind and Next.js, feel free to reach out. We have a ongoing pull request there too. So yeah, as always, check us out on we're on Twitter and we're on clereact.dev and the Cleveland Tech Slack. Should I put a link in here? Do I have a link? Here it is. Oh, you know what? I'm not sure if this link is actually active anymore because people were talking about shutting that down. But yeah, hit me up on Meetup if you want to be on the Slack and aren't, and we can get you an invite. We just have a room there that we kind of put news and stuff like that. And I don't know if there's no more announcements or anything like that. Then I think we'll say good night and see everybody next time. Thanks again, Cameron.
No, thank you. And I'll see everybody next time.
All right. Bye, everyone.
See ya.